Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes.
I should be able to get started in just 1 minute. Still a few people coming on board. Jonica, would you be able to share our slides?
Can you see my screen?
I can, thanks. And I think the chimes have slowed down for a minute, so maybe we can go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody to the fourth. Forgive me, I think it might be a typo. I think it's actually the fifth meeting of the group. Appreciate you all being here this afternoon. And we'll move to the next slide. Just a reminder, it's a large group of people, a lot of great expertise represented here, and we won't call on everyone to introduce themselves right now, but we'll just ask that as you unmute to speak, if you could just give your name and organization. So then we'll go through the agenda for today. So just very briefly, we'll go over that goal setting exercise from last week. Then we'll move into a presentation from the Regulatory Assistance Project on PBR mechanisms, starting to get a little more in depth on these alternative tools that are available. The State Corporation Commission is going to give us a presentation on how decoupling, which is one of those alternative tools, is already actually employed in Virginia on the natural gas side. Then just before we finish, just want to check in with everyone on that regulatory assessment exercise and just quickly see if anybody has any questions we can help with before we finish that up next week. So to begin, hopefully you all get the notes from the goal setting exercise last week, and I think they capture a lot of the good discussions that happened. We've just very broadly tried to capture a few of the overarching themes we saw. One of which was the group wanted to understand the current regulatory framework and identify the specific problems that could be addressed with alternative tools. And one way we'll do that is with that regulatory assessment that's currently underway. I think that'll provide some good insight on this goal and then provide the launch pad for the next goal, which is to go through a balanced consideration of the benefits and drawbacks of alternative tools over the long term. So again, today's presentation from a Regulatory Assistance Project should help the group to learn more about these tools and begin thinking about how to evaluate the various options that are out there. Our next two meetings will also engage stakeholders in these questions of, what are the pros and cons of the alternative tools. And then finally, the group wanted to prioritize areas for recommendation or consideration to the SCC. So that should come together over the course of our work together, and I think in particular over the next few weeks as we start looking at the tools and coming to our conclusion, we should be able to think what we want to capture in that final stakeholder report. So does this about capture the conversation from last week at a high level? Again, there's a little more detail in the notes that were sent out following last week's meeting. Or is there anything else anybody would want to add at this point? You can just raise hand if you want to speak. That seems about right to everybody.
Hey.
Yes, John.
I'm well. How are you?
Yeah,
Well, that's
I'm
good.
on board with the Virginia Energy Purchasing Governmental Association. Sorry. Say, I went looking through my emails, and either I misplaced it, or it was not sent out as meeting notes from the last meeting, or it was posted on. Where do I find those? It's probably my fault. I apologize.
Two places. We did send out an email right after the last meeting, or I believe, and John can correct me if I'm wrong, that they should be up on our website as well. And we'll make sure in the follow-up email to this meeting to give everybody that link again, because that web page is where we're trying to capture everything we're doing in this process. So we
Okay,
have the meeting recordings and everything else.
I can get it off the website for the agency website, because that is in the link. The link is in the email. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries. Anybody else just to have any thoughts on these goals? Oh, sorry, I think there's something in the chat. Oh, thank you, Catch. Catch has very kindly put the web link in the chat for us. All right. Well, with that, we'll move on to the main component of our program today. We have Mark LaBelle from the Regulatory Assistance Project with us, and he's going to take us through some of the thinking behind performance-based rate making, and then dive into some of those tools that can be applied. So I'll hand it over to Mark and let him share his screen.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Jonica, for the invitation today. Good to be here with everyone. I've attended a few of these stakeholder meetings over the last few months, and I think there's been some really great conversation and a lot of great expertise. Hopefully, I'm adding to that. I'm certainly not an expert in Virginia utility regulation, so I'm trying to bring together some of the higher level issues and doing a deep dive on performance incentives in particular. I guess to introduce myself, I've been with RAP for about 6 years. I have a law degree, but I've been doing utility policy and energy work of different kinds since I graduated law school. I was a consultant before I went to law school. The Regulatory Assistance Project in general is a global nonprofit that works on cutting edge regulatory issues. And we were actually founded by two former state utility commissioners over 30 years ago, and doing utility business model work related to performance-based regulation has been part of our subject matter since our founding. So, for a number of reasons, I think it's important to take the long view on some of these things, and I also love the history of all of this. So you'll see some of that reflected throughout my presentation. I think we said if there's genuinely clarifying questions, people should feel free to raise their hands, and I'll try to call on you. But otherwise, we're going to hold questions until the end. After my slides are done. I won't keep you guys too long because I know there's other things to discuss today. But with that, I'll get started. So really 3 different areas that I want to talk about today. Sort of the big picture of rate making and, the most common complaints with current traditional or typical regulatory and rate making structures in the United States. Then I'll do a little section on the key components of PBR, performance-based regulation, as it's typically discussed around the country. And then we wrote a paper on performance incentives more specifically that came out a couple years ago, year and a half ago now. So I'll do a little bit of a deep dive on that particular topic. So look, I will try to distinguish clearly between things that are my opinion and things that are sort of facts in one way or another. But my view here is really that PBR is a set of tools that state regulators can use to incentivize improved utility performance. But it's not a shortcut. The tools, like any tool, can hopefully make your lives easier, make the regulators' lives easier, and ultimately something you can, view as leverage to use a smaller amount of force to get a greater result. But it's not a shortcut. There's no one weird trick here to get you exactly what you want. At some level, modern performance-based regulation, I think, should be considered a formalization of an improvement on less rigorous methods that have been used historically by utility regulators and policymakers. because as long as there's been utility regulation, policymakers, stakeholders, commissioners, whatever the government agency is, has always cared about the performance of their utilities. And if there are problems, they figured out ways to respond to them. So I really think this is about making those more formal, more rigorous in a way that's fair to stakeholders and the utility. And it's not necessarily something new, like performance has always been a key concern for policymakers. And then even comprehensive PBR is a set of small to medium-sized reforms on cost of service rate making. And if you really want to get, more out there, there are lots of other options. But PBR, as it's typically discussed, still revolves around key aspects of how rate making and regulation have traditionally worked in this country. And I want to emphasize that none of this is revolutionary. These are small to medium-sized improvements in that framework, in my view. And look, if you want to accomplish something, you shouldn't just be looking at PBR either. There's a much broader universe of potential policy reforms if you care about certain kinds of issues, and you don't want to get too narrow in terms of your chosen policy venue. And then when you think about the utility choices, it's not just one policy that sets the utility's priorities or dictates their choices or shapes their choices. It's the whole picture. So my metaphor for this is a Rubik's Cube. You have to look at all the sides to understand what the answer is. You can't just look at one color or one side and then be satisfied, because the other 5 sides are still going to be scrambled. So to step all the way back, I use a version of this slide in almost every presentation. What are we doing here is really the bottom line. There's a bunch of public policy goals that influence every single decision that utility regulators make. You want to have efficient competition and control of monopoly pricing. We want reliable provision of service, societal equity. While some of these terms are new, universal access and affordability really are equity issues when you get down to it. Economic development, sometimes I include employment in this category too, meeting environmental and public health requirements. These are all long-standing public policy goals that influence every aspect of energy policy and utility regulation. Now, when we're narrowing down just a little bit to setting utility rates, there's really 4 key things, going back to Brombright or other foundational texts, that we're trying to accomplish here. We want to have reasonably effective recovery of the revenue requirement. We want to have customer understanding, acceptance of their rates and bills. We want equitable allocation of costs across customer classes and across individual customers. And ideally, we want efficient, forward-looking price signals. That's mostly about rate design, but not entirely. So when we're talking about the downsides of the current traditional utility rate making and regulatory structures, I think it's important to understand the history and how we got to that place. Originally in the United States, utility rate making was required to meet a fair value standard under the US Constitution. And when state regulation of gas and electric utilities started in the early 20th century, that was the standard that most utilities had, or most commissions had to regulate to. And there was this funny division of labor of what the states could do and what the federal government could do. And in many ways, the New Deal era, the federal government started to step in new ways. And in particular, the most famous Supreme Court decisions in this area, that's the Hope Natural Gas case, but also the less famous natural gas pipeline case, which is really a great name for a company. Those cases at a fundamental level really legalized cost of service rate making. They said that regulators didn't have to use fair value, and they could use a number of different flexible methods to set rates. And the very specific context of Hope was a decision from the Federal Power Commission where they ordered a Standard Oil subsidiary to cut their rates, because looking at the older methods and applying the newer cost of service techniques, with all the depreciation and depletion and all sorts of other things that were going on in the gas rates, the Federal Power Commission decided that the rates to end users in certain states had to be lower. So naturally, the regulated entity wasn't super happy about this and sued all the way up to the Supreme Court and ultimately lost. So, all of this should be viewed from the context of cost of service rate making was a tool to lower rates, and the other key thread of New Deal energy policy, of course, was expanded access. So this was really the foundational reason for going into cost of service rate making to begin with. Now, what is cost of service rate making? There's really a traditional version of this where there's a uniform system of accounts that tracks and sorts costs in a standardized and transparent way. It's sort of the same across states, but not identical often. And there's established process and substance for a rate case. You have to pick a test year to establish the annual revenue requirement. Expenses are passed through at cost. Utilities do make money on the capital investments. But all of these cost recovery is subject to key criteria, including prudence or use and usefulness. This depends on the state. And then in the most traditional version of this, rates are set in the rate case and not adjusted at all until the next rate case. So that's really where things were in the 1940s and 1950s to a certain extent. And there's a diagram of revenue requirement, cost allocation, and rate design on the right-hand side of this slide. So going back even to the 1960s, there's plenty of discussion of the downsides of cost of service regulation. I have a book on utility business model reform from the early 1960s that I found a couple years ago. And there's a lot of common through lines, although some new issues have come up over the years. Essentially, the first and most common one in many cases is that the cost plus revenue structure for utilities doesn't provide a lot of incentives for cost control. And I should mention now also that there's always another side to these arguments, because regulatory lag is one phenomenon that leads to some incentives to cost control within the traditional structure, which we'll get to. Given the way that utilities make money off of capital investments, there's often an incentive to make capital investments to earn more money, particularly if the rate of return is higher than the cost of capital. The throughput incentive is a concept that came up starting in the 1970s and 1980s. It was well observed that under certain rate-making formulas, utilities make more money from selling more energy. That's true of many businesses, but it's often true in particular of utility rates given their structure. There's not really a lot of built-in incentive to coordinate with neighboring utilities and jurisdictions in traditional rate-making structures. And then the process is also slow if costs are changing quickly. So, you can pick up utility magazines from the 1970s, and a lot of these complaints are already there. So, I just want to emphasize that these arguments are not new and have been around for a long, long time. And even before anyone came up with the name performance-based regulation, there's always been policy reactions to adverse events or performance failures by utilities or by the energy system. There was a giant blackout in the Northeast that led to the formation of NEPOOL, in particular, the New England Power Pool. And the idea there is that you require the utilities to coordinate to lower costs and improve reliability and resource adequacy. Escalating fuel prices in the 1970s led to the implementation of the fuel adjustment clauses. And all these things have pros and cons, of course, but one thing that fuel adjustment clauses do is they guarantee the financial solvency of the utility, which means they can continue to serve the public with utility services. And then, the big fight in the 1980s was that inaccurate load growth projections led to debates over the wisdom of certain capacity investments, and many jurisdictions did in fact disallow significant costs for nuclear plants or other types of investments in the 1980s, which those disallowances did benefit consumers. At least one utility went bankrupt, but there was certainly a lot of fighting over this. And this was part of the political story that led to restructuring in the 1990s. So, at least dating back to the 1980s, we have this quote: there's been recognition that almost every single aspect of utility regulation has some effect on utility incentives. And I think the most famous quote, which I was able to trace back to here, was the idea that all regulation is incentive regulation. And this is the chair of the New York Department of Public Service at the time, and he argued that in this context, the difference between good regulation and bad is that better regulators try to align the incentives so that the best economic results for the customers also produce the best economic results for the stockholders. And this gets at a number of the underlying concepts that I'll be getting at later in this presentation. So, if all regulation is incentive regulation, then all types of regulatory reforms actually do change the incentives of utilities. And that means there's an enormous number of ideas out there for utility business model reform. And even if they're not included specifically as performance-based regulation or performance-based rate making, you can think about how those policies impact the utilities' incentives or would change their behavior. There's many different ways to categorize these. I have divided them into two here, ones that are specific to rate making and ones that are more structural. We don't need to get into all of these, but the point is that there's so many different policy reforms to think about that could have different impacts on the outcomes and performance of the utilities, and that the world of solutions goes far beyond PBR. So with that, I'm going to go down into what people talk about when they talk about PBR. Now, the definition for this stakeholder process and proceeding is, of course, specific to the Virginia resolution that was passed, I guess, a year ago, and includes a specific list of things to look at, particularly for Virginia DOE and ultimately the Commission. And some of these, but not all of them, are typically included in a list of PBR policies. Now, I think there's not one authoritative definition of PBR, but I think the most common elements that people do include when they talk about PBR are mostly mentioned in the resolution: multi-year rate plans, decoupling and revenue regulation, metrics and scorecards, and performance incentive mechanisms. Now, earnings sharing mechanisms, which aren't on that particular list in the resolution, are also frequently included in PBR, but not always. And then the resolution itself mentions several things that I think are quite interesting and worth exploring, but are often not on every single PBR list. Fuel cost sharing, all source competitive procurement, strategies to equalize financial incentives for capital and operating expenses. And again, that's not to diminish them at all. These are perfectly good ideas that could be explored. I'm not going to go into them in my presentation today, but they can certainly be part of Q&A or other discussions in the process. So look, the first PBR item on that list is multi-year rate plans. And often the key goal that people have in mind with a multi-year rate plan is that the utilities can't come back for another rate case until the end of the rate plan. And that's sometimes called a stay-out period. And one of the key policy goals of the stay-out period is an incentive for utilities to reduce costs. And the general idea there is that if the utilities reduce costs and their rates stay the same, they get to keep the money. So it incentivizes cost cutting. And in a pure version of that, the utility does keep the costs and customers don't immediately see the benefits. In theory, the customers see the benefits in the next rate case. If the utility cuts costs, that then becomes part of the test year, which then becomes reflected in the next set of rates that gets approved by the Commission. Now, some people think that that goes a little too far, and in any number of ways. Stay-out periods can be softened for the utility's benefit with cost trackers or exogenous cost recovery provisions. Often fuel adjustment clauses are not part of the stay-out period or other things like that. And then it's important to recognize that earnings sharing mechanisms, which benefit consumers in an important way, actually dilute the cost reduction incentives of a multi-year rate plan because the utility earns less from cost cutting, so they have less incentive to cut costs. The other key point of multi-year rate plans is that all parties benefit from fewer rate cases. That's fewer resources in any number of ways that get expended in the administrative process. Now, there are downsides for multi-year rate plans that have been experienced historically. The most famous one that my colleagues knew about, I was not doing utility policy work in 1986, as you might all guess, is the Pacific Northwest Bell had a multi-year rate freeze, and they didn't have any restrictions on what they could do to cut costs. So they behaved badly. They both cut customer service and they changed the customer service telephone line to a pay 1-900 number that customers had to pay for. So they cut service and they initiated new fees. And even worse, because it was a pay by minute pricing structure, they had an incentive to keep customers on hold to make more money. So this is sort of a perfect storm of bad behavior from a utility, which was sorted out, I think, in relatively short order by the regulators when everyone figured out what the utility was doing here. But, taken to the extreme, a multi-year rate plan can give the utility incentive to cut costs in any number of ways that you actually want to avoid, which raises the hard question of what are good cost-cutting techniques and what are bad cost-cutting techniques. This often flows directly into the idea of metrics, scorecards, and performance incentives, but I'll get to that in another minute or two. The other problem that comes up in this context quite frequently is called the throughput incentive, because traditional rate making sets prices, not utility revenues for a particular year. The revenue requirement is an input into the prices, but doesn't get used later on in the process. And under typical utility rate structures, usage-based rates link revenues to sales, so the utilities tend to make more money with more sales. And this incentive to increase sales is called the throughput incentive to put more energy through the wires or gas through the pipes. The public policy response to this in many jurisdictions is called decoupling or revenue regulation. This breaks the mathematical link between sales volumes and revenues by using trackers and adjustments over time, so that you have under recovery in one year, the utility recovers that extra money in the next year, or if the utility over recovers in a given year, they have to give that money back to customers in the next year. This does guarantee the utility will recover their costs or revenue requirement over time. Sometimes there are collars or other limiting mechanisms that sort of bound the level of adjustment you can have from year to year. But the objectives here are to improve economic efficiency. It keeps the utility's incentive to improve its operational efficiency while removing the utility's incentive to increase net income by increasing sales. This also does reduce risk for both the utility and customers, reduces impacts on utility revenue from weather, economic changes, as well as impacts from least cost actions like investment in energy efficiency or distributed energy resources. Now, this gets us into the whole topic of metric scorecards and performance incentives, which I think can really be thought of as a continuum rather than discrete policies. And in this context, I really do want to get back to the idea that utility regulators and policymakers have always cared about the performance of utilities. And that they had informal ways of knowing whether performance was good or bad. Obviously, if there's a big blackout, that's a major news story in any state or even across the country. But there were often more fine-grained ways that utility regulators had some visibility into how utilities were performing in one way or another. And regulators had ways to respond to good performance or bad performance. And, even though it often wasn't explicit, utilities would get rewarded or sometimes punished, again, informally, in different types of policy discussions. And that includes different reforms or different things like, are you going to improve a full rate increase or require a rate cut? So there's all these, in the past, there's been all these things that, maybe it was more sublimated or underneath the surface, but there was still monitoring of utility performance and some informal rewards and punishments for good or bad performance. Now, look, there's a number of funny things about informal performance monitoring. If you actually want to be rigorous about it, you want to have good data. If you want to be fair about it, you want to have data that everyone has confidence in and access to. So that's really what data reporting requirements should be about, at least in my view. That the point is to have a fair and common source for understanding how utility performance is. Now, that doesn't get rid of all the debates, but having a common grounding and understanding of something that can be measured in the real world helps improve the discussion and move it from a sort of informal hand-wavy notion to something that's more objective and rigorous. Building on data reporting requirements, you can then go to rankings and targets where you see how utilities compare to other utilities in the state, in the region, in the country. You can have targets for improvement that are not linked to any kind of financial incentive. And then you have sort of another wide world of things you can do with performance-based financial rewards and penalties for the utilities. So I'm going to do a deeper dive on that last topic. We published a paper on this a few years ago. We worked with a finance expert who was formerly with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, as well as some other colleagues. And we really tried to bring together a few different perspectives on these issues. So, there's some frustration, I think, in the regulatory community, among my bosses maybe, that performance incentives have some promise that has not been fully taken advantage of. And the nice thing about them, in many ways, is that having outcome-based performance incentives, either rewards or penalties, encourage utility management to strive for improvements without micromanaging the means to get there. Because it just looks at the outcome. It doesn't look at the means to get there. Now, there are some downsides to that too, but I think that's one of the nice things about this. It's a little more hands-off than some more command and control alternatives in some sense. But across the country, in many contexts, performance incentives to date have been pretty small as a percentage of utility revenue or other metrics, and really have been add-ons to existing rate-making practices. And you sort of get hemmed in because the utility doesn't want big penalties and the consumer advocate doesn't want big rewards. So you're stuck in this weird zone where the only common area of agreement is this teeny tiny thing that, in the end is small and might not make that big of a difference. So, again, this is not something that's new. This has been around for at least 50 years or longer. Initial performance incentives were often for generator availability. One of the historical complaints about the electric system is that vertically integrated utilities in some jurisdictions, their big generators would fail a lot and they would be out for maintenance. And that's a big problem for both resource adequacy and costs. Another key area for performance incentives historically was customer service. Many states have customer service performance incentives of one kind or another. Starting around 20 years ago, energy efficiency program performance incentives have become common. And one hard thing about this area of debate is that rigorous evaluations of performance incentives have been pretty limited. And it's an area where counterfactuals are difficult. There have been some evaluations saying that energy efficiency performance incentives do improve energy efficiency program performance, but it's very limited and kind of a chicken and the egg kind of a problem. But there are a number of states in the last decade that have paid increasing attention to this area: New York, Hawaii, Illinois, Rhode Island, a few more, and focused on a few newer metrics: peak demand reductions, GHG reductions, electrification. Still mostly small performance incentives, at least as a percentage of utility revenue. So we wanted to really take a holistic look at all of this across three different key lenses, if you will. I went through already a bunch of the policy issues. What are the problems with cost of service rate making and how can PIMs possibly help? I'm a lawyer. I'm not licensed to practice in Virginia. I am licensed to practice in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So I did a legal section looking at the Hope decision and some other key Supreme Court and other judicial decisions that influence what you might think in this area. And then the finance pieces, because I think there are some important links in finance that I think I'm very lucky that we had a great finance colleague to explore those issues with. And you really have to understand all three of these areas and how the linkages across them work in order to think about reforms as a package, because these three different areas really do work together to shape my thinking on it now. Now, starting with the policy aspects of this, when you think about how much an incentive can change utility behavior, it's always a relative calculation. As with many other things, you have to think about both the costs and the benefits to the utility. And when you're giving a performance incentive or reward or penalty, you have to understand what the countervailing existing underlying incentive is. And our metaphor for this is, are you going up a steep hill or are you on flat ground with a boulder in particular? If you're trying to push a boulder up a hill, you need to apply a lot of force. If you're going on flat ground or even going downhill, you have to apply a lot less force. So if there's something that the utility doesn't want to do for some reason, whether it's financial or cultural or other reasons, and you want to overcome that natural inclination, you have to provide a big amount of force to overcome that issue. So that does beg the question of, do you want to apply a performance incentive first, or do you want to find some other way of addressing that underlying issue? Now, when you're doing performance incentives, ideally you try to look for a triple win, a better win for consumers, improved outcomes, and net financial benefits for well-run utilities. Obviously, that does leave some risk potentially with the utilities. No utility wants to be judged as poorly run, but it can be appropriate to have worse financial benefits for poorly run utilities as a public policy matter. That doesn't mean you want to bankrupt them, of course. On the legal front, I think there's a few broad guidelines you can look at, and there's citations and legal cases in the paper. The big takeaway on Supreme Court cases in this area is that it's the end result of the rates that matter and the overall impact on investors, and that there's lots of flexibility in the methods. The standard for capital attractions is that there's a range of reasonable returns, and the constitutional minimum you can think of as a relatively narrow compensation for risk. The standard for returns comparable to other entities is not a dictate to compare to other utilities, but a broader market measure, most likely. And then look, shareholders do not receive absolute protection from the consequences of poor management or adverse changes in markets. That's part of being in a capitalist society, that there's some risk out there for privately owned companies. Then when you get to the key financial considerations, a few things to really think about. And this is the same as the quote from Peter Bradford earlier. Utility management work for existing shareholders, and that their goal is maximizing shareholder value. And it's key in this context to think differently about existing shareholders versus potentially new shareholders. The return on equity used in rate making and the market cost of equity should be thought of as two different things, and there's important conceptual distinctions between the two. And then the value of performance incentives, rewards or penalties, must be evaluated based on the relevant choices for the utility. In particular, you must correctly value the capital investments, which gets you a little deeper into the finance concepts. Now, our suggestion in the paper, to boil it down, is a four-step process. You have to find a reasonable market cost of equity, and that is in line with a lot of thinking in setting the return on equity anyways. You have to set a base revenue level for expected utility performance, including a base return on equity, which is really a policy variable in many ways. You have to have a process for identifying your policy goals, prioritize outcomes, and create specific metrics, measurable metrics for financial incentives. And then you need to set the reward or penalty formulas. And if you want these things to matter, but also be legal and helpful for everyone, we suggest 4 key principles. Materiality has to be big enough to matter to the utility. The benefits should be commensurate with the overall costs to ratepayers. Constitutionality goes without saying that every government action needs to be constitutional, but there's specific 5th and 14th Amendment things that apply here. And then clarity. Everyone needs to understand what's going on, and clear expectations from all stakeholders, utilities, and regulators is important as well. So none of that's totally rocket science. Let me bring it back to a little bit more of a concrete example. On the left here, we have sort of the traditional model of utility rate making. A lot of it is operating expenses, particularly if you include depreciation expense in the blue bar here, and you have a rate of return. That's, all this is the full revenue stack, right? Now, you can think about this in two different ways, and rewards or penalties of the same size get you back to the same place more often than you might think. And it's mostly a matter of timing of the revenue collection in some circumstances. Because if you want to have big rewards or big penalties for the utility, you certainly could do it in a way that is favorable to one party or the other. But you can have it be the case that big rewards are available for success on key outcomes. And it can lead back to roughly the same amount of revenue for the utility. So you're really encouraging the utility to strive for excellence to keep their financial performance intact. People tend to think about penalties differently than rewards, but I think I would encourage you to see that they're similar in many ways. You can really write penalties, the mathematical formulas, as the reverse in terms of the penalties. So you can really just flip signs, and you're getting to almost the same place in the end. And it does have to do with the timing of the revenue collection, because the reward or penalty can only come after the measurement is complete. So it's really what happens in the second and third years of the rate plan. So and there's some funny timing things to think through for both the utility and ratepayers in terms of how a multi-year rate plan would play out with differences between the first year and subsequent years of the rate plan. So hopefully that we have a discussion about this, and I'm sure there's questions. There's always more detail to go into that I didn't include in these slides, but just a few key takeaways on performance incentives. If you do zoom out to look at performance incentives and rate making holistically, I think it does broaden the scope of reasonable options, and that you're not just stuck with a few small rewards or penalties that don't really matter. That's typically been the approach used in many states so far. And the key thing is, if you want a significant response from utility management, you probably do need larger performance incentives. When you're comparing options, shareholder value and the stock price is the key criterion for evaluating utility financial choices. And legal concerns should be satisfied if the utility has a reasonable opportunity to earn their market costs of equity. So look, there's lots to debate here. Hopefully this is informative in many ways. And I've gone all the way from the high level down to the nitty gritty of performance incentives, but thank you for bearing with me, and happy to stop there.
Thank you, Mark. That was very informative. Does anyone have any questions for Mark? I mean, this is a great opportunity to ask questions and better understand both the mechanisms of these tools and their relative strengths and weaknesses and how they alter incentives. So please just raise your hand if you have questions on anything that Mark covered there. Rachel.
Thanks, Larry. This is Rachel James with the Southern Environmental Law Center. And Mark, I had a question. I think you said something to the effect of like there hasn't been, I guess maybe detailed evaluation of the effectiveness of PBR implementation across the board. Did I hear that right?
That was specifically about performance incentives,
Okay.
but there's been some study of different pieces of this.
Okay. Well, my question was, are there best practices? But I would guess if there's best practices, there's some evaluative component that has happened.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, well, look, I think there's been evaluations, but there hasn't been like detailed econometric studies. So perhaps we should distinguish between the two. I mean, I think that there's been, there's been cases where things have gone wrong. That the phone company case that I showed you is a clear misfire. But there's mostly been muddling through on some of these things. So we have a bunch of sites in our paper for what's out there. But there's really been a new level of interest in this in the last 5 years. So maybe there's some academics out there that are looking at the most recent round of implementation to help us with that.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. John, I see your hand up next.
Hey, Mark, thank you. Your presentation was excellent. Very much appreciate it. I have a question for you about a hypothetical that is reflected in the reality of something that's happened in Virginia, and just get your comments on how it might fit into performance-based rate making. So one of our public utilities was able to do a debt securitization through a legislative action to cover the cost of some fuel that had been built. A large debt had been built up from the customers. They had not paid the cost of service in terms of the fuel adjustment clause. And so the legislator said, well, let's let them securitize this debt through a third party agency. And so really it kind of affects the cost of service in a way, because normally the utility would have to carry the finance charges of that debt or something. Could you just comment on how that kind of thing could fit into performance-based rates, or if it has any relation to it at all, based on your opinion, please?
It's funny. So as I said, everything is incentive regulation. So if there's, utilities are allowed to securitize an expense and pass it through to future ratepayers, that has benefits for current ratepayers and costs for future ratepayers, but also definitely lowers the risk to the utility of certain decisions that they're making. I mean, this gets at the fact that there's the fuel cost sharing item on the resolution list is the closest to what you're talking about here. PBR done well, I think, in my opinion, isn't necessarily about things like that, but it's better thought of as a more flexible outcome-based encouragement tool, rather than some specific fuel purchasing decision, because you can get into the weeds on any of these number of other things, but I don't think it's directly related in most cases.
Okay. Well, the reason I was asking was that we know, the stakeholders know, that the utilities, or at least one of the utilities, has shown an interest in doing that. And so to maybe know that that's something that they would be interested in, it just seemed like it sparked a place for performance-based rate making, possibly. But thank you for your analysis. Appreciate it very much.
I would also add that PBR as a tool is sort of value neutral. It's like each state can think about the things that they care the most about, and they can measure those, and they can try to hold the utilities accountable for good performance on those items. So, but doing it through an incentive or penalty for certain fuel cost practices may or may not be the right way. You may want to do fuel cost sharing or different hedging requirements or any number of other things that are totally separate from the traditional discussion of PBR. So.
Thanks, Mark. And for those who are interested, Jonica has shared the link to the RAP's performance incentive paper in the chat. And then I see Rachel has the next question.
Yes, thanks, Larry. Mark, I think one of the slides you included mentioned an important consideration of materiality in developing the appropriate incentives. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Specifically, I'm interested in who determines what's material? How do you get to that, answering that question?
Have you ever thought about going to law school?
Well, I'm a lawyer, but maybe I should have just.
Well, look, no, this is kind of it's like what's reasonable. It's one of those things where you have to work it out in context. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule for stuff like that. I mean, $1,000 is not going to be material, but other than that, I don't think there's a real.
Gotcha. Thanks.
Right. Laura's next.
Hi, Mark. This is Laura with Clean Virginia. Thank you for your presentation. So we've been learning throughout this process that one of the most important tools, or one of the most prominent, I wouldn't say important but prominent are multi-year rate plans. And so that's something we've been kind of analyzing and studying and discussing here, and is kind of the amount of rate adjustment clauses or riders that currently our utilities are allowed to use. So the State Corporation Commission explained that almost 50% or a little bit more than 50% of utility costs are recovered through riders. And we also know that in the future, almost 75% of costs are recovered through riders. So we are slowly moving towards a regulatory system that basically uses riders for every single new thing: gas plants, transmission line, solar, everything under the sun. And so I was wondering if you could provide a little bit more or comment around, the use of riders. And so that's kind of the first part. Could you comment about the use of riders? And then the second part is like, how do you, if you had to do a quick kind of description of a dream, how would you fix or course correct that?
So there's definitely been a debate on this in every single state around the country. I think the best practice is try to limit riders to certain categories of costs that are truly not controllable by the utility. But there's so many different ways to do a rider, because even riders, while they don't require a full rate case, you can still require a showing by the utility that can be lower or more rigorous for the inclusion of costs. So, it's the more things that are in the multi-year rate plan, though, the stronger the incentives for the utilities to control costs across the board. So you can think about some different scenarios in that case. But the best practice is to really only use riders for things that are what's called exogenous, sort of where the utilities don't have a lot of control over them, and they're sort of not linked to other costs that the utilities have control over. So, Massachusetts has lots of riders too. And every time you approach a rider, there's a set of people that think this is the highest priority and we really need the utility to do it. So we really need certain cost recovery. So that tends to be the dynamic in every single state.
Thanks, Mark. And then Elizabeth, you're next.
Hi, yes, this is Elizabeth Chavez from Virginia Organizing. You mentioned a minute ago that PBR is essentially value neutral. So I think for the lay people amongst us, if there were a particular value or set of values that you were trying to further, how, is there a resource other than picking your brain that could kind of clue us into what is the best set of responses to that, whether it's within PBR or outside of PBR? So if it's like improve energy efficiency, what are the set of tools that would best advance it? Or is it like so specific to the context of the particular state that like we just basically need a team of consultants to come in and figure this out for us?
So, I'll just refer back to some Massachusetts experience. When people wanted to ramp up energy efficiency in Massachusetts, they changed a bunch of things about the structure of the energy efficiency programs, the statutory criteria for the energy efficiency programs, and added a performance incentive for the utilities to administer the energy efficiency programs. So, I don't think any of that's rocket science. So I think that everyone here is perfectly capable of thinking through that level of the analysis. The thing that I think is harder sometimes is if you want to pick a metric or an outcome in PBR, what are the things that are easily measured, but also tightly linked to the result that you really care about, particularly in the context of like gaming the statistics. So this is the kind of thing that might be a little more technical for people, particularly on things like reliability and what counts as blue sky reliability versus a storm event reliability, and what should or should not the utility be penalized for in that context. So that's a sort of situation where some technical expertise is needed. But if you care about energy efficiency program results, there's plenty of publications out there on best practices there, for example. Same on equity or any number of other things. It is subject matter specific, though, in many cases.
Thank you. And then Joe is up next.
Hey, Mark, it's Joe Reed, and I helped to lead up the commission work for Dominion Energy here in Virginia. Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was very balanced. One question as we go through this process, have you, and the answer may be no, but have you had a chance to study any of the existing performance-based metrics that are part of the regulatory construct here in Virginia, like performance-based ROE adjustments or earnings sharing provisions, or the ability to project rates over a multi-year period for base rates for the electric utilities and similar provisions like that are already part of existing law?
The short answer is no, and that's why I led with that caveat. I may continue to be involved in this process in the future, and may be able to dig into that a little bit more, but the short answer is no.
Okay, yeah, just curious, because one of the threshold questions that, at least from the company's perspective, and perhaps some other stakeholders that I think we have to address as part of this process is this a solution in search of a problem, right? Do we already have an effective performance-based regulatory construct in Virginia?
I attempted to make no judgments about the existing contract. I think there's very few regulatory areas where additional attention doesn't identify some improvements, but
Sure.
I'm open-minded about the right answer for Virginia, and was not trying to be prescriptive. So
Great. Well, thank you again.
All right. Thank you. Laura, you're next.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. I think it's interesting. I think we should try to move past of like, is this a search for a problem that doesn't exist? I think one of the issues we've been raising is moving towards a system that is heavily reliant on riders, and I think multiple presenters have been clear about the need to limit this type of tools. And so I think we've been identifying several problems that I think we are trying to explore, so it will be helpful if we move past that context, because another problem we've identified, which is very clear, is having energy efficiency targets that have not been met. So the questions that multiple stakeholders have raised is like, should we modify the energy efficiency regulatory framework to a framework that includes penalties for not complying with the energy efficiency targets, for example, which is one of the alternatives or tools that Mark presented? Or should we explore, a win-win like decoupling, where the utilities' risk for decreased sales is minimized? But yeah, I think it will be helpful to move on that kind of setting, that saying that there are no problems that we're trying to solve here, because we're trying to understand the current incentives of the regulatory framework we have. And again, having a system that relies on riders, and it's something that multiple presenters here have defined as potentially very problematic in terms of utility incentives to control costs. So I just wanted to kind of put that out there. Thank you, Larry.
I think that speaks for itself mostly, but I will mention, I mentioned Massachusetts a few minutes ago. In addition to all the other policies that Massachusetts put into place to encourage energy efficiency, they also did decoupling. at the same time. So they did all of these things at the same time because they wanted to push energy efficiency.
Thanks, Mark, and to Laura and to Joe's points. I would just encourage people to fill out that regulatory assessment because both the energy efficiency standard, the RACs, the current performance incentive mechanisms, they are featured in there, and it's a good place for people to lay out their understanding and their perspectives on those and give us that launch pad for the rest of our discussions. So does anybody else have any questions? Kajsa?
Hi, Mark. This is Kaja with the Virginia Energy Consumer Alliance. One of the things that we heard from an earlier presentation from RMI was the difference between comprehensive PBR and incremental PBR, whereas incremental is typically adding, new incentives to align utilities with the other incentives that we're trying to reach public policy goals, et cetera. And then comprehensive PBRs when you're both adding new incentives, but also removing the perverse incentives that exist. And so I wondered if you had thoughts on what that actually looks like in practice, right? Like, is that something like Massachusetts doing all of these things at once? Because in Virginia, for example, we have some performance incentives already, like Laura's been mentioning, the energy efficiency resource targets, for example. And so, in a state like Virginia, if we were interested in exploring PIMs, are folks typically starting with what they already have and making tweaks? Are they doing comprehensive overhauls and redesigning these PIMs entirely? Just wondered kind of what that looked like in practice.
So we work with our friends at RMI quite frequently, and I understand what they're trying to get across in saying comprehensive PBR. I do prefer my own framing of this, which I gave at the outset, is there's a bunch of small and medium-sized tools that I think can make the lives of regulators and stakeholders easier while also being fair to the utility. And there's also a broader set of policies, like what is the right return on equity is a question that every regulator wrestles with, that it has incentive impacts, and I put up the whole list of all the options, not every single option, but I put up a longer list of options earlier because look, if you care about a certain set of outcomes, you can put in place new substantive policies to advance those outcomes, and you can address them in PBR, or you might not need to address them in PBR, right? So look, I think the Hawaii framework, the things they're doing in Illinois, the things they're doing in New York are all pretty sensible. Hawaii is more towards the comprehensive end, I think, underneath the RMI framework. The Illinois and New York ones are a little more incremental. So Connecticut might be doing something that's a little more comprehensive. It's a little bit of both.
Thank you. Thanks, Larry.
Thanks, Kaj. Joe, did you have another question, or is that hand still raised from earlier? Oh, we can't hear you if you're speaking.
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah, that was legacy. Sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. All right, Laura.
Hey, Mark, talking about that fuel cost sharing mechanism idea, could you expand a little bit about, why states have kind of explored that as an option? And so what are states trying to do with those fuel cost sharing mechanisms, and what they are about? Versus what currently exists in multiple states, and including Virginia, that is a pass-through. So basically, whatever the utility spends is recovered from the customer.
Yeah, so I think it's worth going back to the 1960s to explain what the situation used to be, right? Because there was a rate, 4 cents a kilowatt hour, whatever it was. And then gas and oil prices go through the roof. They double or triple. the utilities rate is still 4 cents. So, you know, the utilities were caught between a rock and a hard place. Do they buy fuel on the world markets if the cost of that fuel is several multiples of what their rate is? And sort of the decision, for the most part, in the 1970s was, yeah, we just need to buy fuel, we need to provide service with the existing power plants to customers, and we need to find a way to pay for it. And the way to pay for it was just to put those costs in a tracker, in a fuel adjustment clause that went up and down every year according to purchase costs, right? Now, the obvious issue there is that if the utility gets automatic pass-through of those costs, they have very little incentive to manage either through purchasing, forwards, hedging, any number of other techniques, their choice of power plants, their choice of assets. They have very few incentives to manage those costs. Now, one incentive they have to manage those costs, because of other potential defects in the utility rate making model, is to build giant new capacity investments. That was one solution that was done in many places, right? So, but for a while now, at least Washington and Missouri, possibly some other states, and this is only relevant if you're still vertically integrated. If you're a fully restructured state, there's the situation is different. You don't have a fuel adjustment clause. There's different issues, but you don't have a fuel adjustment clause anymore. But at least Missouri and Washington, maybe another state or two, have had some kind of cost sharing provisions for the utility. And the idea is that you're supposed to encourage the utilities to manage those costs. So if they manage them well, they get benefits under cost sharing. If they manage them poorly, they lose some money under cost sharing. So that's the idea of the 1960s, the fuel adjustment clause, and then why some states went to fuel cost sharing.
Thanks. And then I see John's hand raised.
So thank you, John Lord, the Virginia Energy Purchasing Governmental Association. So I was looking at the link that was put in the chat to the regulatory assistance project page, and it seems like your advice, if I'm reading it correctly, is that we really, as a stakeholder group, should be focusing on clarifying what are the policy goals. Like, what do we think as stakeholders are the most important policy goals? What are the outcomes and what are the metrics? Like, that's where we ought to be spending our time. Am I reading that correctly? And could you maybe expand just a little on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's some practical aspects to picking the data reporting metric and financial incentive requirements that are important topic for this group and the commission report. I didn't go into it a lot, but I have some thoughts. If you're just talking about data reporting, it is possible to require the utility to produce an enormous spreadsheet of data every quarter or post it every month on a website. The utility has it already. If it's not covered by privacy concerns, it's not an enormous amount of work for them to copy and paste something from an internal spreadsheet into a website, right? So there are always privacy concerns and other concerns about certain things in that process. So that's one discussion, right? But when you're narrowing down onto sort of key metrics, particularly those things that might go into financial incentives, that is really a values discussion. And as I said earlier, PBR itself is values neutral. It doesn't tell you what to care about. And I'm not here to tell you what to care about, but the people of Virginia have things they care about, and the stakeholders here have things they care about, and I think that is an important potential discussion. The one technical issue I'd flag is, I think in terms of financial incentives, it's somewhat important not to end up with a list of 20 or 50 items where you're applying a financial incentive. Because in the end, they just end up being too small. If you value something and really want to put a dollar amount on it, I think it has to be material, so you don't want to dilute it in that way. So that would be my only sort of technical advice on that topic. So.
Thanks, Mark. And any other questions for Mark? Laura?
Thank you, Mark and Larry. So I think it would be helpful if you could expand a little bit on, why so much economic research and papers and RMI and RAP and all, like everybody else, like a lot of researchers and think tanks are thinking about multi-year rate plans versus, so right now we have a biennial review of rates where the utility basically uses the last year as a reference, and then they adjust future costs for the next year. So for example, they say, hey, we're going to need more money for storm recovery next year than we did last year. So they adjust those costs, and that's the revenue requirement that is used for setting rates. And so and that happens every 2 years, basically. And so yeah, rates get updated every 2 years on top of the amount of riders we have. So my question for you, if you could expand a little bit on like what's the benefit that these multiple analysts have found on having multi-year rate plans that are longer than 2 years, and replacing a lot of riders with a multi-year rate plan.
I should point out that I did not actually write a paper on multi-year rate plans. The paper was more specifically on performance incentives. And I work on utility rate making at large. So rate cases, stay out periods, multi-year rate plans are sort of part of that separately from the performance incentive paper. I think the reason for some attention to this is that within a cost of service rate making structure, you only have so many options to control costs, and that multi-year rate plans end up being towards the top of the list. You can have new planning requirements, you can have different kinds of programs, you can run rate cases differently. We could come up with a list of 15 things, some of which that are more exotic than others. But look, multi-year rate plans, I think, are a conventional way to encourage the utilities to control costs that is not that big a change from current practices, which is why there's substantial attention on it.
Thanks, Mark. Do we have any other questions? Okay, Rachel.
Thanks, Larry. I think this is a follow-on question from the last comment. I feel like the term multi-year rate plan and then a conversation around rates that are planned for multiple years, I think those are two different things, but because I hear both sort of spoken about as though they're quite similar, I'm wondering if you could speak about the distinguishing characteristics between the two.
So this is the kind of thing where there's like 17 different flavors of chocolate and some people care about one versus the other, but then sometimes you refer to all of them the same. I think there's lots of different subtleties here, some of which can be important, some of which are not. I think you can also separate out issues. I think you can have performance incentives totally separate from a multi-year rate plan and not do a multi-year rate plan and still do performance incentives. So that doesn't really answer your question, but.
Are you asking me if that answered my question?
Well, yeah.
Okay. Maybe I didn't ask my question well, and it might just be research that I need to do to ask it more specifically. I guess what I'm trying to differentiate is like if a multi-year rate plan isn't that different from what utilities who do, for instance, biennial rate making, like if it's not that different, in what ways is it substantially different such that it could be meaningfully impactful to change? Does that make sense then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, it's not that different. I mean, the 2-year, I think a lot of people think that to encourage real cost control, you need some time between rate cases in order for the utilities to get some benefit from the savings. So that's why you hear people say 3 to 5 years instead of 2. But like, there's not a totally rigorous set of analyses underpinning that type of a thought. And again, there's not that big a difference between a 2-year rate plan and a 3-year rate plan. Well, there's a 50% difference between a 2-year rate plan and a 3-year rate plan. So, I think that these concepts are very similar and not that different. But again, different people might have different things in mind when they say multi-year rate plan. Because there's many different ways to adjust revenues and rates from year to year, and some people prefer one or the other, or try to rule some out and rule in others. But it's sort of a multiplying set of small numbers of alternatives.
Okay, thank you. That is responsive.
Thanks. Joy, I see your hand raised. Is Joy Lovin? Are you able to unmute? Okay. Well, we'll give Joy a second. Does anybody else have questions? All right. Joy, are you able to unmute and ask your question now? Okay, well maybe we can circle back in a little bit and check if Joy's been able to ask. Any other questions for Mark? Yes, Carrie.
Yeah, good afternoon, Carrie Hearn with the Commission on Electric Utility Regulation. And Mark, thank you for your presentation. I guess my question is relating to if we were to take a certain goal or policy value that stakeholders agreed upon, and for the sake of argument or simplicity, let's just say exceeding our energy efficiency goals and really, ratcheting those outcomes up to a greater extent within, or for that goal, would you say that there's an approach within the PBR framework that you would research and facilitate in terms of using tools within the framework, or would you, take a certain policy goal and then say, what are all of the tools that you could be looking at, including and outside of the PBR framework? In other words, are there things outside of PBR that we're not discussing because it's sort of contained within this limit that you would recommend exploring if there are certain policy goals that stakeholders agree on?
So, I think there's obviously more than one conversation and more than one forum happening in any state at any one time. When I'm from Massachusetts. Sorry for keeping referring. And there's a specific relevant history here. When Massachusetts did energy efficiency performance incentives, it was totally disconnected from a broader PBR concept, which you could say was maybe not the best way to do things, but it definitely served the ends of expanding the energy efficiency programs. In this context, I think that there's, in PBR specifically, there's no harm in including it here, but there are ways to think about it that should be informed by the broader policy conversation around energy efficiency. You know, because there's all sorts of, I don't do detailed energy efficiency program policy for the most part, but there's lots of discussion in some places of, do we move from just a megawatt hour target to some more holistic target across electric and gas utilities that's MMBTU, sort of energy neutral, right? So depending on whether your policy is single fuel energy efficiency separately, where you have megawatt hours and therms and separate targets, that's one approach. But if you're trying to come up with a more holistic energy base that's not per fuel, you may want to look at a PBR metric that is, you know, MMBTUs instead, right? So there's definitely feedbacks between both discussions. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. Laura, I saw your hand go up for a second. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so I think we might need like I think we might not have any more time, but you know, the multi-year plans is kind of one of those key elements that are referenced a lot in the idea of performance-based regulation. But so Mark, so you say there is no substantial difference between 2 and 3 years, but would you say is there a substantial difference between, like, so if I told you, hey, we're gonna go to a yearly rate case, you would say, oh, that's not different. You know, there's
well, look,
yearly and like 5 years or something like that.
No, I tried to walk back my own statement, because look, there's a 50% difference between 3 and 2, right? So look, it's every year. A year is a long time. A year is a lot of money for a big utility. So going from 2 to 3, I think, would matter. Going from 2 to 5 would be a bigger difference. But there's all sorts of pros and cons of choosing a shorter period versus a longer period, and might influence other details of the policy, like would you want an earning sharing mechanism, for example, because earning sharing mechanism does dilute the cost savings incentive. But if you have a really long multi-year rate plan, then there's a long time before the next rate case where ratepayers could benefit from the cost cutting. So you have to think about how all these things work together, all the sides of the Rubik's Cube.
Okay. So let's say we have a biennial review of rates and an earnings sharing mechanism. So you'd say in that context, the earnings sharing mechanism could be diluting the cost containment incentives for the utilities.
Yeah, shorter rate plan, fuel adjustment clauses, earnings sharing, all of those things do not encourage cost cutting. Let me put it that way.
And Joy, I saw you'd come back in. Are you able to unmute and ask your question? It's not. Does anybody else have any questions for Mark?
Sorry, Larry. I know I'm asking too many questions, but so I just wanted to kind of complement one of the comments previously, and is in Virginia, Mark, we so you know, both utilities we're in affordability crisis basically. So we saw that recently during the General Assembly. Electricity bills have been going up in the APCO territory, and in Dominion territory has been a little bit more controlled, but let's say there is a lot of spending, more than $35 billion worth of spending in you know, anticipated expenditures, which is going to be reflected in higher electricity bills. So that's kind of one of the problems that I think are very clear from the regulatory system. So I wanted to know, like, if you could help us make a link between, you know, these PBR efforts and the affordability crisis that we are currently experiencing in one of the territories, and affordability crisis that we're heading towards in the other territory.
So look, bill affordability is an important public policy objective across a number of different utility regulatory areas. And if that's the major issue facing you all, there's relevance in PBR, there's relevance in multi-year rate plan design, there's relevance in all the different rate making pieces. But I would just start, and I'm sure you're doing this too, but there's things you can do on the planning side, on the program side, on the procurement side. There's, the every single regulator in the country cares about affordability, cares about costs, and there's lots of different things that have been thought about and tried across all sorts of areas to help with that question. So, I think there's relevance to PBR, but again, it's not just, we're no longer talking about just PBR, of course.
Any other questions for Mark? Okay, well, thank you, Mark. There were lots of questions, and we appreciate you answering them all and giving us so much of your time and expertise.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Jonica. Thank you, everybody. Always glad to talk with everyone and really appreciate the time and attention. So I'll probably be here until 3. People can feel free to chat or email me too. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So to follow up on what Mark has presented to us, we just had a couple of discussion questions for the group, a couple of polls, and then I think we'll take a short break before the SCC's presentation. So these are the different PBR mechanisms that are listed in the resolution for us to consider. And then we had a few questions, Jonica, if you could flick to the next slide for a minute. And I think what I'll do is I'll put these questions in the chat, and then in a second we can go back to the different tools and go through them. And we just want to hear some perspectives on what you've heard, and try and get a better idea, for this group of where we should focus our time. So if you can go back, Jonica, yep, just very, this one we'll do one at a time through each PBR mechanism, but just do you understand how this may be applied in Virginia? And just what we mean by this is, at the high level, based on what we've learned so far and what you already know, can you understand how this mechanism could be implemented in Virginia and how it may alter the regulatory structure? So the first one is the reporting metrics. Does anyone have a view on if we're still struggling to understand how that could be implemented? Again, we're talking high level, not the exact mechanics. Just want to make sure we actually have some common understanding when we discuss these tools moving forward. Okay, what about scorecards? Or I think metrics, scorecards, and performance incentive mechanisms are lumped in together. Does anyone have any thoughts on those, or their understanding of them? Okay, and then the next one we talked about a bit today, decoupling the electricity sales from utility revenues. Are we starting to understand how that works and how that might operate here in Virginia? Yes, Kate.
This is an area that I feel like I don't know very much about at all, especially how it would work in Virginia. I'd love to learn more about decoupling, how it works in the gas industry here, and how it could work in Virginia.
Great. Yeah, well, hopefully that SCC presentation after our break will kind of start the ball rolling on how that might operate. And Rachel?
Yeah, Larry, sorry, I think I was trying to figure out if I should say this at the performance incentive mechanisms or in the other, but the question I'd asked Larry earlier about materiality is a question that I have. So I feel like I have an understanding of performance incentive mechanism structurally, but understanding sort of what is material enough to actually drive the desired, like to actually incent whatever the performance is still less clear to me. So I'm not sure if that fits here or if that fits in other.
No, that makes sense. So it's, you have the levers we can pull, but which one's actually going to make a difference? Does that sort of sum up your comment?
Yes.
Yeah. And then we have Matt says, similarly would like more information on decoupling. Okay, well, yeah, maybe we can revisit that question after the SCC and just see about what else we might need to do to dive deeper there. Kajsa?
Yeah, my question, I think, is similar to Carrie's and John's earlier around performance incentive mechanisms, and maybe I'll read the RAP report and that will tell me more, but it's more of a process question, like how are stakeholders working together to come up with performance incentive mechanisms, and how do you move past the point that I think Mark was referring to earlier, where, you have some like outlandish ideas, perceived outlandish ideas on both sides of an issue, and then you end up somewhere in the middle that does very little. So that's just like a consideration I'd like to figure out in the process as we think about performance incentive mechanisms.
Thanks. Right. And does anyone have any other thoughts on decoupling or the first three items? All right. And one we talked about quite a bit. And so do you understand, again, at the higher level, how multi-year rate plans work and how they may operate here in Virginia? Rachel, I see you're unmuted.
Yeah, sorry. I feel like I thought I did, and then the little bit of back and forth with Mark left me feeling, and I'm not blaming Mark, I'm just saying I had a place of understanding. I'm not in that same place. So I'd welcome a bit more detailed discussion about that.
Yeah.
I'd like to just echo that. This is John Lord. I thought I felt like it was something that we understood that could be a PBR mechanism, but it sounded like that it's a separate issue and maybe not a PBR mechanism. So having some clarification on that and where we all stand would really be helpful.
Right. And Mark can correct me if I'm wrong. I think multi-year rate plan was listed under his typical PBR mechanisms. I know and we'll share his slides, but he did divide them into those mechanisms that are generally considered PBR, the ones that are sometimes considered PBR, and the ones that are not PBR, and that I suppose would, in our study, be considered the alternative tools. Forgive me, I thought, Laura, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, I think, again, this is something we've been hammering on because I think it's an interesting system. The system we're kind of heading towards, and so yeah, it will be interesting to kind of understand in a parallel of, all right, so this is where we're heading, right? Biennial rate cases plus a bunch of riders versus the idea of a multi-year rate plan, because the promise of a multi-year rate plan is it provides the utility with more cost containment incentives than the current system we have right now. And so I think understanding in more detail how that transition could look like, how do you put a bunch of riders back into the base rate, and how do you expand the duration of the rate case practically, and whether or not, that effort could actually, push rates down by incentivizing the utility to cut costs in strategic or smart areas that do not undermine reliability or customer service, because that's kind of the whole theoretical promise that has been, that other states have experienced and other jurisdictions in Canada and the UK have experienced. So I think we are lacking kind of that detailed transition between what we have right now and how can we make that transition towards kind of the promise of multi-year rate plans, and what practical things would need to change, and again, how can we, or whether or not we could see actually material benefits in decreased costs. Again, to emphasize my point or my response to Joe, we are experiencing an affordability problem. So we're not looking for problems here. We have a problem of affordability. And the idea or promise of a multi-year rate plan is that it will create incentives, material and financial incentives, and market-like pressures for the utility to control costs, for example, doing incremental energy efficiency, demand response, managing fuel costs more responsibly, all that to be able to recover their costs and profits within the framework of a multi-year rate plan. So yeah, I think maybe we're lacking kind of that step between what we have in terms of rates and how we could transition towards the theoretical kind of better framework of a multi-year rate plan and what that technically would mean. I don't know if we need to dive into those complicated technicalities, but some sort of initial deeper dive into that would be helpful.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks. And I see a note from Kate at Clean Virginia as well, also wanting to dive a little deeper into the multi-year rate plans. And then Carmen, I saw your hand raised.
I did, but Laura covered it.
Ah, okay. Okay. And then I think the next, well, sorry, did anyone have any other comments on multi-year rate plans? So the next one, earning sharing mechanisms. Are people getting there with their understanding on how that could operate? Okay, and then fuel cost sharing mechanisms. I don't think this was in Mark's presentation originally, but I know he covered it in the question portion. Yes, Carmen?
Okay, for me on both of these mechanisms, I think it would just be really nice for people to understand what mechanisms are in place right now in our current process, and maybe the SEC presentation is going to cover that next. But just to have that basic understanding of how these sharing mechanisms actually can work under the regulatory framework we have now.
Understood. And then Rachel, your hand was up next.
Yeah, my comment is about both earning sharing and fuel cost sharing. I just think after Mark's presentation, wanting to understand if either of those actually, when implemented, would go against the desire to be more cost conscious or implement more cost controls. I think there's a component of sort of understanding them individually and then understanding them as applied in connection with other things to understand whether they help to achieve a desired outcome or not.
That makes sense. And then Kate.
Rachel and Carmen covered my points beautifully. That's how I was feeling as well.
Okay. So any other thoughts right now on earnings sharing or fuel cost sharing? Yes, Christian.
Hey, Christian Tucker for the Virginia and Old Dominion Committee for Fair Utility Rates. I think understanding the kind of the status quo. I know the fuel factor statute has some pretty strong language around utilities' duties to minimize costs. And so I guess the comparison between what we have as our current statutes and how that compares to fuel cost sharing mechanisms, I think is important, because I think, to Rachel's point, we don't want to get to a place that's worse off, unintended, than the law we currently have. So just understanding where these things intersect with the current statutes that are in place.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah. And Robert?
Yeah, I'll just add to that point. When we have these presenters come in, and this is the second one that did this, they don't take a look at our mechanisms that are in place. And it would be very good if we had one of the presenters that actually studied a little bit about the Virginia, then compared it back against other states where things are successful or unsuccessful.
Thanks, Robert. Anybody else have any comments on these earnings and fuel cost sharing? All right, then I think our last two are two that were not covered in Mark's presentation, but they are part of the resolution. So, I mean, does anyone have any thoughts on their understanding or how we should address best practices for all source competitive procurement or strategies to equalize financial incentives? Okay. Well, if that, we'll go into a couple of broader questions, and we'll also cover these in the polls. But just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, so about the all source competitive procurement issue. Yeah, to the point to other presenters. Right now we have a lot of RFPs for a lot of different resources. And this is one of the key components of cost control. I think from Clean Virginia's perspective, our emphasis is in cost control incentives to as market-like mechanisms to incentivize efficient expenditure, as opposed to having the state corporation commission staff kind of reviewing every single decision of the utility. We think in general PBR could be a more direct market-like, again, incentive to cost control. But then the point here is that RFPs are a natural kind of easy tool to understand, which is the utilities just put these RFPs to procure projects that are cost competitive based on different bids. So that's pretty straightforward, and we have a lot of RFPs right now. I think it will be important to understand what are the gaps there. For example, for fossil fuel facilities, we don't have to do any RFP, and so it will be interesting to see how we expand those requirements to all type of resources. I think the same is true for transmission lines, and there is this limitation about ownership. So sometimes third-party owned projects might be less expensive, but because we have different limitations, customers cannot benefit from lower prices that are third-party owned. So I think there's a lot there to understand and to see, how can we bring cost savings to customers, strengthening competitive best practices.
Thanks, Laura. And I see a couple of comments agreeing with what Robert had said about maybe having one of our outside speakers take a closer look at Virginia. So we'll consider that. And then Elizabeth had a question about what are the strategies to equalize financial incentives to deploy capital expenditures and operating expenses. So I'm wondering, could Mark, or we have a couple of other experts in the call, is there somebody who could give us the just quick take on what that means?
I think the one is called TOTEX, which changes how in most U.S. rate making systems, you just get a rate of return on capital investments. Under TOTEX, you sort of shake the snow globe and you get a rate of return on part of your operating expenses and part of your capital investments. There's other accounting issues and other things involved. The simpler alternative, at least in my view, is to take a hard look at the return on equity and the return on debt, for that matter. But in particular, the return on equity, if it's too high, is thought to over-encourage capital investments.
Right. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so before we move on to our other questions, does anyone have any other comments just on sort of our understanding of these mechanisms and what we might need to do to better understand them? Okay, well, in that case, maybe what we'll do, our next few questions are actually covered by our polls. So maybe I'll hand it over to you, Jonica, and we can run the polls. And as we're going, if people want to comment on the results or why they made their choices, we can do that. But I'll let you lead, Jonica.
Yeah, thank you, Larry. So yeah, we'll start with the first question. What I'll do is just enable the poll, and everybody should be able to see the question. The first question has an option to select up to 3 So please be mindful of that, and you'll have about a minute or so, and I'll ask before I close the poll to respond. So yeah, I'll get started with the first question. Is everyone able to see the first question on their screen?
I can.
Yes.
Thank you. So yeah, as I said, please select up to 3 options, and yeah, I'll give a heads up before I close the polls. Is anyone else facing this issue where it says the bot is disabled and contact IT admin for information? I think Victoria is having the trouble.
Same.
Okay, I do see there are certain responses coming in. So it's not disabled for everyone. Could it be your team settings if that gives you an option to change settings? I'm trying to look something on my end as well.
Yeah, I'm taking a look. I don't see a lot of options around the polls. It seems like it either comes up or it doesn't.
So yeah, I think Victoria has mentioned that her vote went through and it still gives that that message.
Sorry, I'm
So,
not sure if my vote went through. It may or may not have.
oh, okay. Yeah, I see there are 12 responses that have come in.
Okay. Well, maybe what we can do is close the poll and show the results, and especially for those who are worried their response didn't get captured, you could maybe describe what you picked or what you think is most important.
Okay. mm, I'll just pull up the responses on my screen. Um,
Jonica, this is Joy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
For whatever it's worth, I saw briefly what you put up and then it disappeared. So not enough time to study. So maybe it's my settings. I've been struggling with that. So I'll just go back on mute and watch.
If you had a comment, you can also just yeah, say.
Yeah, I can see the results in the chat, but Jonica, are you able to bring it up on the screen for us?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that, but it doesn't look like I can pull it up on screen, except if it's in Excel format, which is hard to look through.
Well, I'm happy to describe it, and then if we are having issues, maybe other people can just chime in if it seems about right to them or if they disagree and we want to focus elsewhere. But the most votes was by for 24% of votes was performance incentive mechanisms, and it was kind of clearly out on its own. And then we had a lot of the others that had it had 7 votes, and then we have a lot of the others that have 3 or 4 votes. So it gets pretty even after that between reporting metrics, scorecards, decoupling, multi-year rate plans, and the financial equalization we just talked about. And then it's pretty low, just 1 vote each for fuel cost sharing and all source competitive procurement. And yeah. So maybe we could quickly run the next poll, Jonica, but we'll just keep it open for a minute, and we'll discuss those results too. But it looks like maybe some votes aren't being captured, so we can think about other ways to get that. Maybe something, yeah, like Carrie says, something after the meeting.
Yeah, I think we can do that. So should I go ahead with this next poll?
Let's try this one, just see if this next one works, and we'll.
Okay, and this one has only 1 response. So everyone should just pick one option, and also not try, like, if you submit, do not open the poll again. I think that will count as multiple votes from 1 person. So
Can you just orally state the question or poll for those of us that can't see it?
right, yeah, of course. I thought that it did appear on the screen. So the next question is, based on your current understanding of rate making in Virginia, which of these mechanisms do you think would be least effective? The first question asked which would be most effective, and we're trying to capture now just 1 response that for least effective, so we know that this one particular mechanism is something that we wouldn't like to see a lot being discussed, I guess.
Yeah, so I suppose as was discussed, the one that either wouldn't have much of an impact or potentially might even be counterproductive, as was discussed in a few instances.
And is the poll up on the screen for people?
Yeah, it popped up in the same way.
It's shared. It shows up in the chat.
Oh, okay.
But I'm still getting a message that says the bot is disabled. Contact IT admin for info.
I see the poll on my screen as a pop-up, which is what ideally it should have been, but apologies for not having that on your screen. I think if you're able to look at your chat and then hit submit vote, I think that would work as well.
I can give another variation on an error. I'm getting a something went wrong, please try again message, and then I vote again, and then it's kind of hard to tell how many of my votes are going through or not.
But when you submit,
when
were
I
you
submit
able
the
to?
first time, I just get an error, and then I'll try again. It maybe went through. I touched the button, but yeah, it's hard to tell.
All right, so polling may be off the agenda for future meetings. But hopefully everyone's had a chance to respond. Pretty, well, I say a clear winner. The votes are kind of scattered here, and obviously not everyone's been able to vote, but reporting metrics got 30% of the vote. Nothing else really came too close. So those are interesting results, but we'll maybe think of sending these out as a follow-up survey to make sure we capture everyone and get the full picture. Right, Anthony? I see your hand raised, Anthony. Are you able to unmute?
Can you hear me now?
We can.
All right. Yeah, sorry. I'm just confused by the 2 poll results. The performance incentive mechanisms won out as the top for what would have the most impact, and and yet metrics was the one that was selected as having the least impact. Am I understanding the results properly?
Yes, that's I think you are.
Okay, well, it's pretty hard to have performance incentive mechanisms without good metrics and reporting. If you put out a performance incentive mechanism, you got to know that the results are coming in and happening the way you want. So you really have to design the metric carefully and report on it and be able to audit it and verify it. So I think maybe there was some misunderstanding of how people were interpreting those choices because they're.
Oh, we lost you, Anthony.
Oh, I'm sorry. You lost me a little bit there. Can you hear me?
We kind of get just right at the end. We lost you.
Sorry. I was just saying that if performance incentive mechanisms are important to the group, metrics and reporting need to be as well. You can't have one. You can't successfully have PIMs without really good metrics and reporting.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. And Katja?
Yeah, just in response to that, I think my logic amongst, I think maybe some of the others, as Victoria has pointed out, is that I was thinking metrics alone would probably not be the most effective out of these list of tools, but I would certainly agree that metrics will be an important part of designing a PIM, and good metrics are definitely a priority.
Yeah.
Yeah. John has mentioned, I think, in agreement that there is some stakeholder disagreement. And yeah, so as Laura said that.
Okay, sorry, John, could you explain what you mean by that?
Well, just to me, it seems like if the polls sort of contraindicate one another, it could be that the polling is not well understood or we're not all on the same page. I do like the comment that Victoria put in that they're kind of isolated options, but if they are, one group says it's going to be effective and the other group says it's not going to be effective, it could represent stakeholder disagreement.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of what we're trying to accomplish with this is just get the idea of where we should be focusing our time. So, I mean, if results had very clearly said it should be focused on one area or another, that would have helped us shape the next couple of meetings. But there does seem to be the broad spectrum of responses. And Carmen?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that has been said thus far. And I think part of the problem is you're trying to conduct a poll that isn't a multiple choice poll. It's I think there needs to be a poll that you're allowed to give some, you're able to give some input in a more I don't want to frighten anybody, but essay type rather than a short answer type rather than a multiple choice type, right? This, Mark said it in his presentation that, it isn't one or two mechanisms that work. It's, first of all, determining what it is that you want to center your values on. What is it that you as a Commonwealth value, where do you want your utility to be performing at its best? And then what is that worth to you in order to make sure that they do that? And so choosing 3 of these, tools or mechanisms rather, does that get to our collective value, or does that get to just what your value is as an organization? And then you're never going to get, because of the variety of stakeholders that are here, and that's what should be here, you're never going to get an agreement that's going to say, Yes, we all want to focus on this, or yes, we all want to focus on something else. But I think we can come to a broader, and consensus is not the right word, but a broader ideal of where exactly we need to land as a Commonwealth around the priorities that we think that our public service utilities should be focusing on in order to provide us the service that they are constitutionally required to provide us, but then we are getting the value for what that service is, getting the value for it. And I don't think that's a multiple choice poll. I think that is more of a short answer essay poll that we really need to have deeper discussions on. And opting out of other options doesn't really give us all of the tools that we need to make sure that we're going in the direction that we want our utilities to go in. And the utilities are part of this process, right? Like, they are the service provider, but yes, they need to be part of this conversation in order to make sure that we are going in a direction that we can all agree to be going in. But yeah, so I just think that this is a difficult way to and clearly not just because technical reasons, but also like understanding the difference uh, between the choices that people are being asked to make right now. It doesn't match.
Yeah, no, those are good points. Our thinking here was just to try and guide, we have 2 meetings left where we might focus on, but I think the point has been made in this meeting already a couple of times. All the different components of our existing system and any new features we might put in interact with each other. So, and that, as Anthony pointed out, with metrics and performance incentives just a moment ago. And in terms of your short answers, I mean, right now we have this regulatory assessment exercise out there. So we're going to use that in the next couple of weeks, but depending on the response we see there, that may kind of form a template of maybe there's an opportunity to do that for these PBR tools moving forward, give people that option to provide a lot more background. The poll was not meant to be a major event as much, just to give us some guidance. Jonica?
Yeah, just wanted to add that, yeah, I agree with the points mentioned, and they're really great points, but we were kind of trying to take a quantified number towards the end of this discussion that we had with all the mechanisms being discussed at length and inputs from all stakeholders to see what they think should be a priority for the next 2 meetings. So, like, just have some numbers in for us to decide where we should head in the next steps for this process.
Right. Thanks, Jonica. Does anyone else have any points to make at this time? All right. Well, we'll close out this section. I know we've been going for a couple of hours. Maybe we could take a 5-minute break and reconvene at 3:10 to hear the SEC's presentation on decoupling. And I think that should allow us still to finish by 4 o'clock. So we'll see everybody back at 3:10. All right, everybody, welcome back. So I have the next part of our program for the day. We have Brian Pratt from the State Corporation Commission here to talk about how natural gas decoupling already operates in the natural gas environment here in Virginia. So I'll turn it over to you, Brian.
Thanks, Larry. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I'm mostly just going to focus on, as Larry said, how gas decoupling works currently in the natural gas industry, specifically in the context of commission approved CARE programs, what we call energy efficiency programs. And Jonica is going to be so kind to kind of flow through the slides here for me. So Jonica, if you don't mind, exactly, if you go on this slide here where it says agenda. So to talk about revenue decoupling for gas, I think I just need to start with kind of the foundation, the context of why we have this and kind of the legislative context of why it's there. So I want to start there and talk specifically about what we call the CARE Act, a particular piece of natural gas legislation, and then talk a little bit about the kind of the basic nuts and bolts of what a CARE plan is, and then how revenue decoupling kind of works within that. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jonica. Okay, so in Virginia, we have something called natural gas conservation and rate making efficiency plans, or CARE plans. They happen within the context of something that we call the CARE Act, which is code section 56600 through 56602. And essentially, this particular piece of legislation provides that a gas utility may apply for commission approval for a portfolio of various demand side management and energy efficiency programs. And so just for kind of high level background on what these programs may be, an example of this would maybe be something like a residential home improvement program, whereby a participating residential customers of a gas utility could maybe get incentives toward upgraded attic insulation that might be more energy efficient for them, or maybe rebates for an upgraded heat pump that might be more energy efficient, or maybe they could have a home audit done of their home where a technician could come in and help them identify ways that they could maybe improve the efficiency of their home, and so on and so forth. And essentially, these are programs that are designed to help gas utility customers conserve energy consumption, thereby reducing their gas bill. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jonica. So kind of basic nuts and bolts, basic components of a CARE plan contained again within the CARE Act. So each CARE plan proposed by a utility would have to have a normalization component that removes the effect of weather from the determination of the results. And that's important because one thing that drives gas sales is not just the efficiency of let's say your end use appliances, but also just kind of what the weather's like. A lot of gas is used for gas heating purposes. And so things like a very cold or very warm winter can greatly affect gas sales. So another component is a decoupling mechanism, and that's going to be kind of the hot topic of this discussion today. And I'll get into more details about what that is and how it works here in a moment. But at a high level, it is a mechanism designed to decouple gas revenues from gas sales in the context of these plans. So it also needs to contain one or more cost-effective energy efficiency programs, and I'll discuss real briefly on what that means here in a moment. And then provisions to meet the needs of low-income and low-use customers specifically. Also provisions to ensure that the rates and services to non-participating classes of customers are not adversely impacted, and a mechanism to recover the cost associated with the programs. So you can go ahead and move on to the next slide, Jonica. So again, just a little more detail on what are these components, like what's going on in a CARE plan. So a cost-effective conservation and energy efficiency program is a program approved by the Commission that is designed to decrease the average customer's annual weather normalized consumption of total gas. So again, think about that heat pump rebate incentive example that I provided a moment ago. If a customer swaps out an older, less efficient heat pump for a newer, more efficient heat pump, that decision is going to result in more efficient gas usage for that customer, thereby allowing them the opportunity to lower their bill. And they do have to demonstrate cost effectiveness when they propose these. There's 4 specific cost benefit tests that the commission looks at. In essence, it involves various ways of identifying whether the net present value of the benefits expected to be received from the program outweigh the cost incurred by the program. And then number 2 and 3, just to touch on this real briefly, you've got a decoupling mechanism and a performance-based incentive. These components are really about trying to incentivize a gas utility to do this. If you just think about at a high level, a gas utility, like any business, is typically going to be interested in increasing their sales, not necessarily decreasing their sales. And so these are components that are designed to sort of align the utility's goal with the objective of doing something that is going to decrease their sales, which would therefore decrease their revenues. The decoupling mechanism is really designed to ensure that the gas utility can continue to recover its fixed cost of service in an environment where gas sales and gas revenues may be declining due to the implementation of energy efficiency and demand side management programs. And when we say fixed cost recovery, we're really talking about the fixed infrastructure of the gas utility. So it's the pipeline infrastructure that delivers the natural gas from the point of gas purchase for the utility to the customer's meter. If you just think it conceptually, those costs are fixed. They do not vary based on a customer's gas consumption and gas usage. Therefore, it doesn't vary based on gas sales. So if you have an environment where revenues are declining, but the revenue requirement to recover those fixed costs was set in a prior base rate proceeding, it does, conceptually propose or subject utilities to a little bit of risk of a potential cost recovery there. The second component here is a performance-based incentive. Generally, utilities may earn up to 15% of independently verified economic benefits upon meeting target levels of such benefits. And I'll touch on this real briefly a little bit later, but they do have to provide or demonstrate that their savings are measured and verified, that they do reporting to do that. And that is where that 15% comes to. And again, it's a basic idea is aligning shareholder interest with the goals of the act. If you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jonica. Just a little more nuts and bolts about a care plan. There, sometimes people will get kind of mixed up on this. So you'll have something called a portfolio, and ultimately that's basically the plan itself. And so the utility may propose a portfolio of various energy efficiency and demand side programs. There may be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different programs that comprise the total proposed portfolio. Each program is composed of a series of targeted kind of focused measures intended to achieve something specific. For example, one program might be, and I think I used this example a moment ago, something like a residential home improvement program, which would be maybe a program designed to help residential customers figure out ways to economize on their gas usage by finding ways to improve maybe insulation or other things they can do within their home. And then within a program, you have individual measures. And the individual measures would be maybe the specific activities or items that compose that program. For example, a rebate on upgraded attic insulation would be a specific measure within the program. A rebate on upgraded heat pumps might be a specific measure within that program. And these are just generic examples. So if you don't mind maybe moving to the next slide, Jonica. Annual reporting, I touched on this a moment ago. If a utility has an approved care plan here with the commission, they are required to do periodic reporting where they have to demonstrate measured and verified savings from their care plan. And so what these utilities will typically do is they will contract with a third-party vendor, and that third-party vendor will review the performance of their proposed plan, that the programs and measures within the plan, and then we'll typically do statistical analysis to see whether it is achieving savings and the extent of the savings that are being achieved. Yeah, you can move to the next slide, Jonica. Yeah, so right now we have 3 gas utilities in Virginia that have approved care plans. And if you look here on this left, or what actually really the middle column, this is the acronym or name for the cost recovery rider that goes along with those care plans. So for example, for Virginia Natural Gas, it's the CPCA. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading that on my screen. But anyways, on that middle column demonstrates the rider that recovers the cost of the program itself. So this would be the cost of the utility to implement the program. And then if you look on the column here on the right-hand side, these are going to be the names of the decoupling mechanisms that I'm going to talk a little bit more about here in a moment. So these are the separate rider mechanisms that are designed to decouple the natural gas revenues with the natural gas sales. So if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jonica. Okay, so revenue decoupling, and a little bit more about why it is there. So if you just think about a typical gas utility, right, is they start to increase their customers and they increase their sales, obviously their revenues are going to go up with that. As their sales decline, obviously their revenues are going to decline with that. If there is no revenue decoupling mechanism, you tend to have volumetric rates. And so if gas sales are declining, that puts the utility subject to the risk of reductions in revenues. And actually, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, Jonica, highlight this a little bit. Here we call it the concept of lost revenues. You'll hear that term in the industry used a lot. Basically, in essence, what that means is, okay, you've got a customer that went in, got that better attic insulation, or got that upgrade to their heat pump. And as a result of that, they're now getting the same energy output that they were before for them, but less energy input at the meter, right? They're using their energy more efficiently as a result of those upgrades. As a result of that, the gas company now has less sales. So there's a sales drop by the utility, and that sales drop comes right along with lost revenues. There's a decline in utility revenue. Obviously, that could be an obstacle to a utility wanting to do a care program, because they want to ensure that they're getting sufficient revenue to recover their fixed cost of service. And then I think we can come to the next slide here, Jonica, just a little bit about the mechanics of how an RNA works. And this is a generic example. It is not specific to any utility, but I wanted to provide you a little more flavor on how a revenue adjustment would actually be calculated, or at least kind of the general concept anyway. So you'll start, and you can look at this top line here, you'll start with non-gas revenue per customer. So that is a number that is going to be set in a base rate proceeding. Okay, so if you think about what a base rate proceeding does, the commission is determining a revenue requirement, which would allow the utility an opportunity to recover its fixed cost of service plus a fair rate of return. And then in conjunction with that filing, there's also going to be information filed on the number of customers that utility served during its test year. So if you take that revenue number and divide it by the number of customers, you get this metric, the non-gas revenue per customer. Again, it's the revenue per customer intended to recover that fixed cost of service, right? So, and again, that will be set in a base rate proceeding, and then that number will also be revised and updated in base rate proceedings going forward. Okay, so in between those two base rate proceedings, the utility will file administratively with staff something that we refer to as an RNA filing, or a revenue normalization adjustment filing. Okay, so in that filing with commission staff, they're going to calculate their target distribution revenue. Okay, so they're going to take that per customer non-gas revenue, they're going to multiply that by the number of customers currently on their system. And in that exercise, they're going to determine the total target distribution revenue, intended to, in theory, represent the amount of distribution revenue per customer that they need to recover that fixed distribution cost. So in this example, the non-gas revenue per customer is set as 40. The number of customers in this example is just 500,000, just generically. And then if you just multiply that together, you get 20 million. Then what they're going to do is they're going to measure that against the actual revenue received by the utility, right? And in this example, it's 19 million. Okay, so their target revenue is 20 million. Actual revenue is 19 million. So thereby you have $1 million deficiency, right? And so as a result of that, they're going to adjust that rider mechanism, that decoupling rate mechanism, to recover a target amount of $1 million. And so that's conceptually how that works. Each actual calculation is a little more complex than this. Each utility that has an approved CARE program and a decoupling mechanism in conjunction with that will have a tariff in their commission approved tariff that literally spells out the process and the exact formula and calculation whereby that calculation is made, as well as the filing process for filing these mechanisms with commission staff and the process for billing them to customers. So that's high level how this works in Virginia. I know there was some questions earlier about how could this potentially be applied to the electric industry, and I don't want to opine on that question because it really is more of a policy question, but I do want to note something, maybe a technical difference that I do think is important for the group to understand. If you think about the gas industry here in Virginia, the vast majority, and for many of our utilities, and probably all of their fixed cost of service is recovered almost entirely through base rates. And so the utility will have a base rate proceeding, and then it may be several years before the utility comes back in for another base rate proceeding. On the electric side, it's a little bit different. A lot of costs are recovered through rate adjustment clauses, or what we call riders. And those riders do have a true-up component kind of baked into them, whereby actual cost of service and actual revenues received through the rider mechanism are tracked against each other. And then there's a true-up component that is adjusted over time. So I do just want to note that distinction there as well. Again, that's very quick and dirty high-level overview of just generally what this is and how it works. I'm happy to answer any more kind of detailed questions.
Thank you, Brian. Do we have any questions for Brian in the presentation? We have one question that, yes, sorry, I see it. We have one question in the chat that says, can we have access to the description of the process for this calculation?
I'm not sure who asked the question. If I could ask for clarification, that might be helpful.
Yeah, this is Laura. You just mentioned that there is
Hi,
a document where you go about calculating that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's outlined in the utilities tariff. Again, so the utilities that have it are V&G, Columbia Gas, and then Washington Gas Light Company. And those tariffs are commission approved, and they are publicly available on the websites of each of those utilities. So you can find that document there. I may be able to put links to that in the chat when we get off here. I mean, but it is publicly available on the websites of those utilities.
Thanks, Brian. That's we can also set that up to send out with our follow-up email.
Okay, great.
Lena, see your hand raised.
Yes, hi, Lena Lewis with the Nature Conservancy. Just, two questions. One is, so would you say that the gas utilities that have this decoupled system are still able to, I guess, make an equivalent return on equity that utilities that are I was going to say undecoupled, that are coupled, tend to make? That's my first question.
Yeah, so if I hear what you're asking, are utilities that have decoupling mechanisms getting the same ROE as companies that do not have decoupling mechanisms? Is that your question at a high level?
Essentially, yes, yeah.
Yeah, so I do not know the answer to that question. I do know ROE is evaluated in the context of base rate proceedings. Fortunately, I'm not one of the staff that does those reviews, and I just don't have that information for you. I apologize.
My second question is, can you speak about the system a little bit from the customer perspective. For a customer of a decoupled gas utility, what is the customer's incentive to use gas efficiently? Why wouldn't the customer think, well, what difference does it make how much gas I use? This is a decoupled system. I'm gonna, if I use my gas efficiently, I'm still gonna get charged the difference from what the utility is quote owed anyway. So why not just use more gas?
Yeah, I'm not sure I could speak from the customer's perspective. Generally speaking, one distinction that I will make is that when a customer implements a program, that the benefit of that program will go specifically to their bill, and they also save on the cost of gas. The RNA, however, is a rate that will be applied to all customers, so not just that customer, but the broader customer base. And it is only intended to recover those fixed distribution costs. So there is still savings on the gas component.
Okay, so the customer who uses less gas is still gonna, like you said the RNA would be say, but the fix is a fixed rate that all customers have to cover regardless of whether they used a little or a lot. So the customer that uses a little is still coming out ahead.
Well, it's not necessarily a fixed rate, but it is a rate intended to recover the utilities' fixed cost, the cost of their actual delivery system. So the pipes in the ground, the regulator stations that go along with those pipes. It does not recover gas purchases, which is the other important component. So if you think about a gas utility, that they've got the delivery system that transports the gas from point A to point B, right? That's the cost that they're looking to recover. But there's also the actual commodity cost of the actual physical natural gas itself. So that cost is going down for all customers.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Yes, Laura.
So could you expand a little bit on the difference between this mechanism and the true-up mechanism? Because I think you kind of mentioned it, but in my head those are similar but very completely different things. Because what I understand from your presentation is that the utility is trying to make sure that their sunk costs are recovered even when they are selling less gas. Which, I mean, according to what you just said, it still generates savings for the customer and generates savings for everybody, because, if you decrease sales, then you have to invest less, and, just general benefits for the system when you are having to sell less. But my point is, it seems that decoupling it's to make sure that the utility recovers the sunk costs, but the true-up mechanism in the riders are different because they are not attached to sales, or weather, but it's just like any under earning will be kind of true up. So yeah, I mean, could you explain the difference or the similarities between those two?
Yeah, so conceptually, I would say they're very similar, that they work very similarly. Again, the revenue decoupling is intended to ensure that the gas utilities cost of service, that their fixed cost of service, so their non-gas costs can continue to be recovered even when sales are falling, right? And so a true-up mechanism does essentially a very similar thing, right? So if you've got costs that are being specific cost or specific cost of service that is being recovered through a rate adjustment clause, right? That cost is going to be tracked on an ongoing basis against actual sales and actual revenues received. So when rates are initially designed, they're designed based on a projection of sales. So if actual sales in a rider are less than the projected sales, and therefore resulting in, say, a revenue shortfall, that could prompt a true-up. It could result in a deficiency that could prompt a need for a true-up through a rate adjustment clause. So they're conceptually very similar concepts.
Just a quick follow-up. Yes, but at the same time, an increase in costs my point is a true-up could be triggered not only by a deficiency in sales, but also by higher costs. So let's say you forecast some sales and your sales are the same, but your costs simply go up. So you activate a true-up. But in the case of decoupling, it only activates because of the difference of sales. So yes, similar, but like that difference makes them kind of fundamentally, in terms of what is the incentive for the utility, different, right? Because again, just let me summarize. Basically, in a rack true-up, they get the true-up regardless of the sales. The true-up is linked to, if there are more costs, they recover more costs. But in the decoupling mechanism, it's not about cost, it's about the difference in sales.
That's fair. I think that's a fair characterization.
Right, thank you. John, your hand's up next.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering if you could comment on
I'm not able to hear him. I don't know if he cut out.
I think we lost him, but he's coming back.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know what happened. I got cut off for a second. Sorry. I'm back. Okay, if you could comment on one of the things that's unique to the natural gas market, I think, compared to electricity, but maybe there's an analog or similarity. There's the storage component. The LDC, needs to be able to provide storage for gas. And then in the electric market, I guess there's like a demand component, there's peak demand periods and demand costs. Can you comment on what, if any, similarities those have and how a performance-based rate might address those things, please?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I could speak to the similarities or differences generally between energy storage or capacity needs in the electric field. I think I can just generally say, a revenue normalization adjustment is really just designed to ensure that the costs that were previously approved in a base rate proceeding continue to be recovered in an environment where you have declining sales. I'm not sure whether a distinction about whether energy can or can't be stored would or should affect that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that, and I think
sure
that it's interesting. And I didn't intend for you to answer the question the way you did, but it was really nice to say that the concept of making sure that there's a recovery based on whatever the previously legislated recovery amount was supposed to be. So that might be not advocating necessarily, but if you had like a multi-year rate making case and for whatever reason there was declining sales, you'd be stuck covering those costs. And in a place where there's increasing sales, then the utility would be kind of stuck waiting for that to be fixed, perhaps.
Okay, thanks, John. Does anybody else have any questions for Brian? Yes, Laura. Oh, sorry, Rachel.
Yeah. I'll go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Rachel with the Southern Environmental Law Center. I think this was said, but I just want to clarify because I feel like much of the discussion has been about deficiencies, but in truing up, if there's overages, things are trued up to refund to customers. Is that an accurate statement in this paradigm?
Yes, I believe that would be accurate, whether that's under a RAC recovery mechanism or a revenue normalization adjustment.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, and Laura.
Brian, is it possible, maybe you don't have the data, and it is hard to distinguish kind of which of the CARE Act mechanisms play an important role in increasing savings in these gas utilities, but the question is, do you think like this tool played an important role in ramping up these programs and kind of having an effective response from the utility? And I guess in the gas sector, like I'm not very familiar, but I don't know if there is any type of target. So any way we can measure, before and after these mechanisms were put in place, the effectiveness and the level of savings increased or stayed the same, or it was kind of it did not make a difference. But I don't know, is there a way, or has been any evaluation about that?
Yeah, let me answer your question this way and see if this answers your question. So if a utility has an approved care plan, right? So they do have to provide ongoing reporting of actual measured and verified savings achieved. And typically they will use a third-party vendor to do that. So, and there is ongoing reporting on achieved savings. So hopefully that might answer maybe one component of your question. I think the other component of your question was, did decoupling play a role in that? I'm not sure that is a question that the commission has specifically evaluated, or at least not to my knowledge. I don't know the answer to that question. One thing that I do think is important to point out is that a utility will get that decoupling mechanism by having the plan. It's not necessarily tied to achieving a specific energy efficiency target, if that maybe helps answer your question.
Okay. Any other questions for Brian?
Sorry, Brian, but would you say that these decoupling mechanisms are a mechanism that de-risk the utility operation in general?
Sorry, you're breaking up there a little bit. Could you repeat your question?
Yeah, so would you say that this decoupling mechanism is a tool that de-risks the operations of the utility? Like, yeah, decreases the operational risk of the utility, meaning there is more certainty of revenue requirement, of profit requirement, and is that in general true? And has the State Corporation Commission kind of incorporate that lower level of risk into ROE considerations?
Okay, so there's two components to that. First, I think you asked, does it do anything to their operational risk? And I'm not sure about operational risk. I think what I can say is it definitely reduces risk of under recovery of revenues and under earnings associated with fixed cost of service, right? That is what the mechanism is designed to do. So I think it does reduce risk of under earnings associated with lost sales on their fixed investment in their distribution infrastructure. With respect to, does that get factored into commission ROE determinations? My understanding is not historically. I do know we have our accounting, one of our accounting staff on the call. I don't know if they want to add to that further, or if you have follow-up questions for that, but my understanding is it typically has not.
Okay, any last questions for Brian? Right. Well, thank you, Brian. And we have just a few moments for a discussion on this subject. If we go to the next slide, Janica. And really just what we want to do based on what you've heard so far today, or what you already know, just want to get some perspectives on the decoupling, the natural gas decoupling, and then what its merits may be for the electricity sector. So interested in any comments anyone wants to provide here. But just a couple of prompt questions we had were, what features of the gas decoupling experience are positive? What could be improved? And then how does it inform our options for electricity? So in addition to what we've just heard, is there anything else anybody would add on decoupling? Yes, John.
Hi, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and say from my experience working at Fairfax County Public Schools, which is a large municipal governmental entity, and we buy decoupled gas from Columbia Gas of Virginia and Washington Gas Light. And the two things that are troublesome, I would say, about decoupling is that not all gas suppliers will work with the local distribution company to present a single bill. And that isn't necessarily a problem. I mean, really, it isn't. But it is troublesome when you process thousands of bills a year, and then you have to process times two. Another thing that can be troublesome is the having to procure the supply. That has a double-edged sword effect. It can be good because you can get a lower cost supplier, or you can look for some feature, like perhaps a certain amount of biogas being injected into the system. But I don't hate decoupling. I don't love decoupling either. It's just another approach. I just want to share my experience. Thank you.
No, thanks, John. That's really good insight into the administrative work around decoupling. Any other perspectives? And again, this could be on the natural gas decoupling if you have experience with that, or just thinking prospectively about how it could apply to electricity. Lena?
I appreciate that perspective, John. I did not work in a public school. I worked in a private school on a campus that had several buildings, and I can just say that our electricity bill was separate for several separate buildings. So I don't know what that says, except for that our electric company, our IOU electric company, that was not decoupled, also billed each building on our campus separately. So I don't know that decoupling had anything to do with that. I find this very interesting just to see that decoupling is possible, that the gas companies are still making profit. And, as my questions to Brian suggested, I think it is important that decoupling does not take away the individual customer incentive to use the product, whether it's gas or electricity, efficiently, and it doesn't. So I find both of those things to be positive.
I'd just like to follow up to Lena's comment real fast, and that is with your accounts and the accounts really of anywhere. Whenever you have a meter, you normally get a bill, one bill per meter per billing period. That's sort of in the coupled or the traditional vertical integrated approach. When you decouple it, you can still have that occur and have your local distribution company provide both the supply data and the transmission and distribution data on a single bill. Or it can be one bill for the account for the supply side, plus a second bill for the same account for the distribution and transmission side. So it has options available depending upon the vendor for decoupled natural gas. And I'm sorry I wasn't clear on that. If you don't have to deal with it, it doesn't really ever become apparent. So most people have little knowledge of such a in the weeds thing.
Thanks, John. Anthony, I see your hand up next.
Yeah, I guess the decoupling issue's been out there for a long time, and utility regulation is sort of one of the first attempts to try to promote a little bit more focus on energy conservation. I haven't really seen, decoupling on it helps to remove the incentive to sell more gas or electricity, but it doesn't really on its own provide any incentive to sell less. And so I think it's just important to talk about decoupling in the context of other performance incentive mechanisms.
Thanks, Anthony. And then Laura.
Yeah, I agree with Anthony. I think, you know, the presentation from the State Corporation Commission showed that decoupling was one of the tools that they used to really incentivize the utility to decrease their sales. And as I heard the State Corporation Commission explanation, the incredible amount of racks we have kind of already give that sort of incentive. So it seems that, you know, if the problem we're trying to tackle is the utilities not complying with energy efficiency targets, and the fact that, you know, whenever the State Corporation Commission establishes a new target, we stakeholders just have to sit and wait to see whether or not the utility is going to comply, but there is not a real kind of financial, it seems that the existing financial incentive did not work. And so, yeah, it seems that, you know, like the idea of thinking how to incentivize utilities to maximize energy efficiency, which is part of the enabling legislation, you know, it's like we need to analyze decoupling not by itself, but as a part of a package that could help or could not help push achieving energy efficiency achievements forward. So, you know, maybe exploring the idea of a penalty attached to not complying to energy efficiency targets, or maybe setting longer term energy efficiency targets, etc. But yeah, it seems that decoupling is just one tool of a package from what, you know, we'll learn decoupling is or was for gas utilities, an element of a larger package.
Thanks, Laura. And I see a note from Lena in the chat, just following up on Anthony's point that decoupling can take away the disincentive for some performance incentive mechanisms to be effective, but it is not an incentive on its own. And I think, Rachel, you're next.
Thanks, Larry. I have a comment that might turn into a question. I feel like decoupling is specific to a particular cost category, and customers' bills are comprised of a variety of categories of costs that are calculated differently. And I think, sort of to bring in things that came up in our earlier discussion with Mark, I think understanding sort of what's recovered through a rack versus base rates, and sort of understanding where fixed costs lie, if they do indeed lie in some cases in a rack, if something that some might consider a fixed cost lands in a rack versus in base rates. Like, I think there's some nuance in thinking about applying it to the electric utility landscape, in understanding how costs are identified and which ones are actually being impacted in revenue decoupling. That feels like a statement and a question in my mind. I realize I didn't clearly make a question mark in there, but like that, I will say that and leave it there.
Thanks, Rachel. Laura, I see your hand up. Maybe not. Any other perspectives on decoupling at this time? All right. Well, thank you everybody for the discussion. If we move to the next slide, please, Janica. Just wanted to check in with everyone on the regulatory assessment template, see if there were any questions, and I think Dan from Current Energy is also on the call. If anyone, just if anyone has had any challenges in filling it out or anything that could be useful. So any questions on the template exercise?
Hey, Larry, I don't know if you've shared this with the group, but I think it will be helpful to see, you know, this idea came, what I understand is that this idea came to Virginia Energy from other states. So it seems that other states have, you know, stakeholders in other states have completed this type of template thoroughly. So if you could send or you could, ask around Great Plains Institute or RMI or somebody that could point us towards an already completed templates, and you could send it to the group. That will be helpful.
Yeah, we can look into that and then share it with the group if we have access to it.
Some of the materials that was provided for other states has been uploaded on the agency website. That might be helpful, and it does go a little bit into templates and into the template for other state, as well as the regulatory cases that were looking into their process. So that would be helpful. I think it is a couple of meetings before, and I can put that into the follow-up email again.
Thanks, Jonica. Yeah, I think those are under the January 17th meeting, and we can double check if the assessment responses are in there.
I'll add there. I don't believe the assessment responses are included on the Virginia page. Some of those other states, they should be filed in the docket history, so it would require a little bit of digging. Which ones in particular I don't quite recall, but I think Hawaii's are probably in the docket search, and maybe Connecticut, Nevada has used something similar. So it might just require a little pulling into the dockets to find those.
Thanks, Dan. Any other questions on the template exercise? Okay. Well, we'll move on to just our next steps, and we'll finish up here. Pardon me. But the first thing is that the template is due by the 19th of March. That'll give us time to kind of package up everybody's response and then potentially use the assessments in our meeting on the 28th. The other thing that ends today is if anyone is interested in presenting a proposal on their suggested PBR scheme to the group, if you could let us just know by the end of today if you're planning to offer that. Otherwise, we'll work on some alternative options for those next couple of meetings. And I think we already have some ideas from today. Finally, we do have the ongoing open public comment period until the final comments in our draft report. So those comments can be, specifically on items from this meeting or more broadly on anything that you think would be relevant to the SCC's study. And then if we go one slide more, I think we've set the, oh, sorry, Carrie, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, just a clarification on that third bullet point. It says final comments on the draft report are due ongoing public comment until the final comments. What is that due date? It's a May date, is that correct?
I think for the comments portion, and that maybe that sentence is a little confusing. I think provisionally we had the deadline as
We did have it.
As April 11th.
Thank you.
But we were still just trying to work out how all our timing works for that final report, but should be another month at least. Yes, Kajsa?
Yeah, I just said in the chat that I have an example from Connecticut and Hawaii of completed regulatory template assessments. If you want me to share that with you, Larry or Jonica, for you to share with the rest of the group. And then I just had a quick question about the presentations. If you could speak a little bit more about what you're hoping those would look like, or if there's a suggested format, length, kind of vision for what folks should expect if they are interested.
No, we weren't going to have any set format because we understand, I mean, some ideas may be a lot more comprehensive than others. So, I mean, it could be a more narrow performance incentive mechanism. It could be a more comprehensive change to multi-year rate plans and decoupling and things like that. We really want to see what people wanted to present, and then the ideas we'll work with them to, decide what amount of time and format would work for their presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm sure we would appreciate those links to the assessments. And if we have, I see one follow up on decoupling from Kim Pate from the SCC. She just says any reduced sales from energy efficiency programs can be included in projected rate year volumes of sales in a biennial review. This reduces or offsets the potential for lost revenues. Okay, thanks for that clarification, Kim. And then, Jonica, if we go to the last slide, so we have set our final meetings. So 3 more meetings to go. So meeting 6 on the 28th of March, we'll probably review the regulatory assessment tool and then potentially use it as the basis to jump into discussions around the alternative tools. Meeting 7 will be focused, I think, in the different alternative tools. And then meeting 8 will be a review of the draft report. So we'll try and get a draft of the report out in advance of that so that stakeholders can review. And then we'll use the meeting just to ensure that all the key items are included and that everybody's views have been captured accurately. So with that, we'll close out our meeting for today unless anyone has any other questions or comments. Okay, well, thank you all for your participation, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Larry, Jonica.